I'll sit down and screencast it.
Okay.
All right. This is Ryan Faircloth and Jay Lee, and we're walking through Use Case Repository 1.1, which is the June 2016 release. What we're starting out with is an introduction to the Use Case Repository for those that are new to the system. We are capturing narratives. Use case is more than just the technical implementation of the use case. It is the story, how you understand what is being done, what problem we're trying to solve, the way that problem is described, and the way that problem is measured. So we start out by describing what this repository does, and we talk about our audiences because we want each user of the repository to consider the other users as content is added and managed. So key areas such as the account team, sales engineering, professional services, and our consultants, in addition to the direct users of the use cases in the customer environment, like our analysts, our managers, and our executives. The scope is to focus on problems managed and understood by information security and compliance. And we start to bring down how do you approach a problem space as large as security. And there's two general ways to do it. Most organizations today are thinking about things in a reactive way. That reactive way is I have data that we already bring in our log management, and I need to justify the expenses that we have. I need to justify the things we do. So what data, what can that data provide for me? Because I already have it. Let me get the value I have. That's definitely a common way to start. The second way of thinking about this is to think from a proactive way, which is starting with an end in mind. We start from a top-down perspective. What are the risks and what are the problems that the organization is facing? And then what are the right things to do to solve those problems and demonstrate measured progress? And sometimes organizations will find that they're doing both at the same time. They focus on the data they have and then walk backwards to the problems, which is where the use case repository starts to show its value for you. So starting out with the idea of data, drilling into the supporting data view, we've presently categorized 20 types of data. Things like mail, things like DNS, things like authentication or anti-malware, things you typically would be aware of. And then we also bring in things like physical security that are beginning to become common use, and customers are trying to understand how they can get value out of that. Within a source like mail, we focus on the specific types of events. Not all mail systems are created equal, and not all mail logs are the same. So the idea that mail from one component of a solution, for example, the external mail filtering system, will provide significant value. But that's different than the value that the internal logs from an Exchange server will provide. Both have specific uses. So then we take from the mail concept, and then we can talk about what types of events you would have and where you're going to get those events. So taking, for example, a well-understood one, email sending, and that is a link to the types of use cases you can get out of email send data. So some very obvious things like servers that are generating email that shouldn't be, that you're not expecting, might indicate some type of command and control or other inappropriate behavior. Data loss, those kinds of things. Interaction with threat activity, those are very common things. But we walk you through that very basic concept to get you to the things that are essential. And we're going to introduce that, which is essential use cases are things that we would expect that the beginner organization, those that are just entering into the security operations world or just bringing in some technology, would be able to implement successfully on this type of data with a reasonable amount of staff and system resources for their size. They're very low false positive and tend to be very high value or high accuracy detections. And then we start to mature, and in the process of maturing, an organization will begin to customize their SIEM, begin to add additional use cases, mitigate additional risk, and we start to provide guidance for what additional value you can get from existing log data. So while one possible approach is to take mail data and find every single thing you could possibly do with mail data, what you begin to find is that if you go beyond the level of maturity in one component of your system versus another, you'll find that your false positive rate, for example, for mail, might be higher than we would expect from a more mature organization because you're not monitoring endpoint anti-malware as well as your peers. So we encourage you to consider that across the board, implementing the majority of or all of a level of use case helps you to be a well-rounded program. And then the next question is, well, will my technology support this? And when we index the technology providers that we're aware of, we point out that, for example, the Microsoft Exchange is an example of a system where you can detect the send as well. And then you might ask yourself, well, what else can I do with Microsoft Exchange? And if you have Microsoft Exchange, you can link there and see that, well, you can see email access, you can see email receive, and you can see email send. And then you can explore left, right, up, and down from the reactive approach of what are my data sources. But that's not really all. The other idea is to be proactive, which is what we talked about in the beginning. Being proactive, and I'll jump back to our beginning here, involves thinking about the problems or the risks that you're mitigating. Most frequently, I interact with customers that are interested in solving a particular scope of problem. That could be, for example, addressing the FFIEC in the United States, or NERC, which is nuclear energy regulations. Or it could be more broad, like, for example, and I'll find it here. The ransomware threat or menace that we're currently struggling with. And the idea is to take the broader threat and address what data sources should you be looking at, and what are you going to see in those data sources, and how will those data sources help you to mitigate this risk. So taking something like the tactical threat of ransomware or advanced persistent threat, as we talked about it 2 years ago, is to focus on things like using the mail data for threat activity correlation, seeing behavior where volumes of email are going to places that you wouldn't expect volumes of email to go, focusing on DNS, passive DNS analytics, command and control detection, tunneling detection, and then how do we use endpoint malware logs. And what can we do? Endpoint anti-malware is rumored to have been dead for years, but it's really not. But unfortunately, many organizations don't think proactively about how to take advantage of their logs. They simply use the data reactively. So we start to talk about the approaches for use cases that would help you to take advantage of that most primitive of data sources to limit the spread of ransomware in your environment. And we add additional concepts from spear phishing. We talk about risk-based adoption as well. For example, the risk of malicious code, the risk of scanning, the risk of denial of service, risks of misconfiguration, abuse of access, and then what use cases could you pivot to address those kinds of concerns. So that's the use case repository in a nutshell, and we would be happy to dig into it further. All right. Now, the great thing about use cases is one use case can service multiple types of problems. So we can show incremental progress in many related areas based on choosing the use cases that we focus on early very wisely. So an example of, for most organizations, is they're significantly challenged by compliance. Compliance, I like to say, and I've heard others say the same thing, compliance ideally is accomplished by implementing security best practices. Unfortunately, compliance oftentimes forces us to focus on things that may not have real security value for our organizations because of other things, but we're going to focus on those anyways. So as we start to demonstrate forward progress, you can begin to think very proactively and say, okay, well, yes, I'm going to want to focus on my compliance use cases, but of those things, I can demonstrate progress and address broader concepts. So, for example, demonstration of progress in compliance to privileged activity monitoring is looking at something like use case 43, direct access to a non-human account. Or an NHA, a non-human account is any type of account that a human is not accountable for. So service process, batch process, FTP, file transfer type things. And when we focus on this use case, one of the things we see is that this is a use case that can address multiple types of problems, multiple types of risks, and takes advantage of a data source that you're very likely to have. So you can link the implementation of this use case to for progress on general compliance across the board. You'll see elements of this being valuable in PCI and NERC and the SFIEC and really just about any compliance framework because this is a fundamental level of thought. You also see that this kind of behavior is also something that endpoint malware will use to pivot and move laterally in the environment when you're talking about remote access type Trojans and being controlled by an active attacker. You also see that this is addressing that concept of security visibility around my user activity. So I'm seeing that my users are doing things. I'm also able to attribute that I'm making progress towards privileged user monitoring. And these are things that you can do, showing that you're doing at 4 different levels of problem types that will be meaningful to your executive and upper management, your general leadership. And then we see that from the compliance and the risk perspective, we're addressing both abusive access and unauthorized access because this one use case could indicate either one. And you can also see misconfiguration opportunities, a misconfiguration that produces a weakness in your environment that can be later exploited. You may find that this particular behavior, when detected in an instance, is not malicious, but is indeed authorized, but simply dangerous. And that provides an opportunity for you to get ahead of external compliance in your security program, that you have methods of identifying risky behaviors, risky things and misconfigurations, that you're continuously applying your principles of risk management. And then we talked about the data source as well. This is simply using authentication events because the authentication events themselves from both the Windows and the Linux platforms can tell us this kind of behavior. In many cases, appliances are not susceptible to this type of thing, but there's ways of expanding this into those additional implementations of data sources as well. And then we talk about what is the value proposition. So that becomes that essential use case. This is one that almost everybody can get value with. It is well understood in the industry and outright expected. It tends to be a critical event because when it is malicious, the next phase of the attack or the compromise can happen very quickly, and the fidelity is high. So even if this is authorized type behavior for a legitimate business need, it is unlikely to be a false positive, so your analysts can pay attention. And then we also start to help you start down the path of helping you to understand the appropriate structure of response plans or playbooks, as they're also known. And the idea is that while we may have nearly 100 use cases in the repository, I've only identified 20 common playbooks right now, which are multiple ways of detecting things that you respond to in the same way. Having a common response plan makes maintenance a little bit easier for those things and also encourages improving the state of the art in your organization. So you can identify weaknesses in your workflow and identify use cases and opportunities to be more efficient in your response and increase the workload capacity of your security operations program. So in analyzing the use cases and actually prioritizing them in your organization, taking that top-down approach, you're able to identify what things you can do based off the barriers you have, meaning, how difficult is it to acquire a new piece of data. If that is a difficult piece of data to acquire, even if that is a medium value use case, you might take on implementing 2 or 3 additional use cases of lower difficulty to show forward progress rather than spinning your wheels on the difficult while you continue to work on the additional things that would be required.